let me just grab my notebook full of questions. So we've got a very wide variety of presentations from there, but all aimed at supporting the National Digital Twin world. Paul, just a quick question on the gig to start with. Now, you mentioned there was a presentation back in 2002, which was the NIST report that came out with the £15 billion, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that was then. Has there been a new look at that and a fresh at that of how much it's actually costing us today? Because obviously back in 2002, our digital world was actually quite small. And I think it's the same when we look at our on-site communication stuff, and the fact that we used to just throw kilobytes of things backwards and forwards, but now we're sending gig and terabytes backwards and forwards. But what was your? Has there been a new study on the kind of the value side of that?
Not that I'm aware of, but at the time, I extrapolated what that 15 billion for the US would be for the UK, and it was about $1 billion for the UK economy. Now, if you upgrade that forecast to where we are today, we're probably talking about double, if not triple that. Anecdotal feedback suggests that in many projects, the costs of poor interoperability are measured in potentially in six-figure sums. We're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds in terms of man hours and technological investment to overcome some of the issues. But it's not been surveyed in a rigid survey of the magnitude and depth of detail that NIST went into. Obviously, as a government-backed organisation, NIST was able to invest a substantial amount to ascertain the impact on the industry at that time.
Brilliant. So, I mean, when we look at that, sorry, I'm just going to on the interoperable side, you're going to get people to sign up for this charter. How are you going to persuade organisations that this is what they need to do? Because to me, I think one of the problems we've had in the BIM world is we've all said, this is a great thing to do, go and do it. But not many people have done it, or it hasn't become business as standard. I love the way bit of a side as well. I love the way you're saying plain language with everything, because we've stopped writing plain language in standards and it's just gobbledygook. So plain language is just what I want. Thank you. But sorry, where was I? Yes. How are you going to persuade them to do that?
If you remember what I said earlier about managing exchanges of information across the contract line, I think if you put a requirement for interoperability in the contract, you start then to procure interoperable information. You don't get paid unless you provide interoperable information. So I think it's a mandate that would be contractually applied rather than just a generic mandate of the kind that we had with the BIM mandate, and which was it had some impact, but didn't really deliver in terms of the major change that we were expecting. I think if you put pound signs against the opportunity here, you're going to get the designers, contractors, subcontractors, all of whom have to provide information. And if they're not going to be paid because they haven't provided interoperable information, that's going to be a very powerful persuader.
Sorry, one more time on that one. Is how would you define that interoperable information? Because you can say you've got to provide interoperable information. They go, well, actually, I can provide you with an Excel spreadsheet, so it's interoperable between me and you because you can read that and I can read that. And everybody can read that, but that's not really delivering the kind of value that we're hoping here. Is there some sort of panel that defines that interoperable? It's a woolly question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We put in place some technical requirements, which were at this stage examples of the types of good practice we would like to see encouraged. So, one of the ways in which you would not be delivering interoperable information was that if you were, for example, exchanging Revit files Revit files, for example, are not going to be something which is going to provide longevity. They're not going to be able to be accessed maybe 5 years into the future, the next time that a version is upgraded, or Autodesk suddenly change their licensing arrangements yet again and hold yet more data hostage to fortune. So, it's about avoiding that provision of proprietary information and urging people to shift to open standards as a way of ensuring that future users can continue to access the information, use it, exploit it, and deliver extra value from it.
Thank you.
Definitely. And I think it's about driving those companies to incentivize them to have those standards, because certainly in our industry, that's what we're driving through our contract performance management right at the procurement process. So, yeah. I've got one for Alison around the education. So if you look at the pipeline of when we plan to get the National Digital Twin actually up and running and make it a reality, how do you think on the education side, on the skills side, are we able to match that pipeline with the skills coming through?
I think so, but I think the mismatch actually isn't necessarily with the skills. I've always argued that, kids invariably have these skills that we probably didn't when we were their age. I think I kind of come back to Paul and mandating, because you've got to mandate in education policy that we will embed this kind of information and therefore education into the national curriculum. I think until, and it's got to go right back with teacher training, because actually it's not about what the kids are learning, it's about what the teachers are learning to teach the kids, if that makes sense. So you've got to go right back into university. There's been a national outcry on initial teacher training at the moment, putting it back into the hands of schools, or is government going to lead it, and so on. But I come back to mandating in procurement. I mean, at the moment, we've been challenging for years that if we want to really, really, really influence education, it has to be right at procurement level. Everybody in this room has an awful lot to give to young people and to teachers in terms of education, but we don't have to do it. We don't have to behave well around schools. We don't have to behave well around a Section 106 any more than we have to behave well on just kind of, doing the usual careers fair. So for me to really, really, really harness the power of the National Digital Twin and really, really give teachers an enormous opportunity to use it as an education tool, it has to be mandated not only in education, but also in terms of all the people who get involved, contractual side, industry side, and so on. So we are at the moment partnering with the NHS. The NHS wants to be transformational around construction. They want to be looking at modern methods and using digital twin data. Again, it's now mandated that if you are going to work and build a hospital and be in any of that supply chain, you are going to work with us and education. So it's quite powerful. It makes you look at education in a totally different way, and you can generate your own pipeline because you are actually, on the ground in the classroom with the teacher, influencing the way that teaching and learning is delivered and indeed received. So yeah, bring it on.
Another quick question on that from me. I seem to remember talking to you a little while ago about actual qualifications that the kids might be able to get from this. Is there any news on that? Anything in the pipeline?
Yeah, there is. I mean, it depends how deep you want to go, and I think you might want your gin and tonics first, Ian. To be honest, it's a heavy discussion. But basically, the government's. I think in fairness, the government. And I don't say this very often because it's been very, very hard since 2010 to influence anything around the skills agenda with the government. But from 2025, children are going to have three choices. They're going to have straight A-levels. And sorry to be kind of bash you with the signs of education, but you've probably got children. You need to know that. 2025, you can do the straight 3 A-levels. You can do the T-levels. Can I just have a show of hands? Who knows what a T-level is? 2, 3 and 2.5.
I can guess, but okay. I don't think I actually know.
Not very many. Okay, well, who's got teenagers in the room? You better figure out T-levels. Okay, or there's an alternative. Thankfully, there's an alternative. It's called an alternative advanced qualification, which means that children can choose an academic route, but at last an AAQ is an alternative academic qualification. Even the word alternative worries me. It means that young people can actually study an academic route, look towards Russell Group universities, because let's face it, every school is Russell Group or bust. And if you're not Russell Group, then at least choose a university, because you're not going to go down the apprenticeship route. So at least now there's one chance from 2025 that children can access a more skills-based but academically focused qualification. So things are looking up, but I think the bigger challenge is not necessarily qualification, it's education of teachers and parents to know what's out there. The fact that we've just demonstrated that nobody knows what T-level is, but according to the government, it's hugely successful and everybody knows and everybody's going down this route. So watch this space in.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've got so first a comment for Dave, and then a kind of like a bit of a question. I love the way that you're doing the Sunbelt City bit and being able to visualize things, because when you're and I do liken this, and my conversations with Max in the past has been, if you're looking at a situation and you need to react to it quickly, the best way you can do is look at it in a gaming type environment, because what do we do in that gaming world? We get people to make snap decisions very quickly with very limited information, using the visualization in front of us of whatever information they need to do to play the game. And in a way, that's what you've done. You've provided the information they need to make a snap decision in a very visual, very quick way that can be plugged into other systems. So the kind of like scenarios that you're working on there, is the thought that those scenarios could be plugged into that national digital twin, the big box of boring? And is that the thought where almost the action happens, and the fact that they've got the equipment to deal with that situation in that location, able to present back to whoever needs to make that decision at that moment in time?
In a nutshell, absolutely. So the idea for this came from seeing and observing how Salesforce actually works with a part of its application called guided selling. So with guided selling, you start with a blank sheet of paper effectively, and you program Salesforce to ask a series of questions, and it comes with the right product or the right service that you need. Putting my sales hat on, that's a really slow way of making a really big sale, because I need to do that for one product. Then I need to think, what is the next product that I need in this scenario? So for me as a salesperson, the easiest thing is to present the end user with a quasi-end solution at the very beginning, i.e. a quick quote or the visualizations that you've seen, and then allow them the ability to either add or subtract from that starting template to fit their emergency scenario, event, disaster, or whatever. So for me, what we're doing is trying to do two things: speed up the whole process, suggestive sell the solution, and do it in a fun way. Because again, going back to, one of the big challenges for our business, like probably most businesses in the room, is attracting talent into our organization. If we want to attract talent into our own organization, we need to have much more digital, user-friendly ways of working. I think providing tools like this and making the digital twin more like a gaming engine will be much more acceptable and accessible to young people who ultimately, based on the 2032 timelines, they're the ones that are going to be using it anyway. And if I could just go back to the point about mandating this in the procurement phase, I actually think there's a phase before that. And again, it's something that you need to think about, and that's about lobbying government. So it's something that we as a business historically would never have really got involved with. But when you look at, say, mega projects of $1 billion plus, from a sales perspective, we need to engage 3 or 4 years before that. It's got us into working with central and local governments. And I think associations like this need perhaps to be educating members of parliament, government departments about what your vision and your goals are. And you should be doing that now before the Labour government, for example, gets in power. And again, I don't know whether you and others in this space need, because if you lobby and you win the argument, then it will be mandated in procurement. But it's an area that most businesses steer away from because they're so frightened of political engagement. My experience over the last 2 or 3 years since those interactions with the Department of Health is MPs and people in central government need to be educated. They need to be educated by people like who've presented here today And they seem to be really keen to soak up knowledge and advice. What should we do when we get into power, or if there's a change of government? And I think that's how you'll win that argument about mandating it in procurement.
One of the things about the Government and Industry Interoperability Group was that it was funded by government. There was an appetite amongst not so much the MPs, civil servants. Civil servants are there for the long term. They reckon that in many cases they become experts in their field. So lobbying those civil servants, raising their awareness of the challenges can be incredibly powerful. And that's really where we're focusing our attentions moving forward. But the code of practice was kind of putting a marker in the sand, starting the process of then moving forward. We want to keep government engaged in this process, get them inputting to it, so that they don't drop the baton. It's important that interoperability continues to be stressed as a requirement for the industry, so that we catch up with industries like aerospace and automotive, which have got much more joined up, integrated supply chains, where interoperability is far less of a challenge than it is in what is still currently a very fragmented sector.
Thanks. So I'm going to jump over to Chaz. So you can, I don't know if you can hear us. Yes, excellent. He's awake. So I really learned something today. I learned that Chaz probably knows more about our company's production and where our stockpiles are than probably we do ourselves, because we have copper, nickel, iron ore across the world as well. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned about how hard the satellite data is to work with, but you also mentioned you got different types of data. So is it possible to overlay those types of data over time and look at, for example, where you've got the high grade stockpiles of iron ore and where you have the low grade, so that you could then look at the supply chain network across the country scale to source those high grade stockpiles? Because obviously high grade iron ore is important in wartime, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you've got to think satellite data, like anything, it's just, you can fuse it together. So adding different layers, so you can add different resolutions and different sensors on top of each other. So, a standard image that, satellite image is really 3 channels, kind of red, green, and blue, so RGB. So that's what we call multispectral. But you can then move into hyperspectral imagery, as I mentioned, and that can go up from 12 bands up to 300 different bands. And when you get into those different bands, you can start to detect different materials, because they'll give a different spectral response from on the ground. Now, in regard to, I can't answer your question exactly in regard to the grade of iron ore, because I'm not the expert on it, but we did a lot of spectral work on iron ore to identify different materials on the ground, because sometimes there will be different materials in the same port location, and sometimes they won't. So it does really depend. I'm afraid there's no hard and fast option, but you can use a difference. You can use a different approaches, such you can use hyperspectral. I said multiple bands. You can also then try and get some radar response, because if you're talking things like scrap steel, you can get really big chunky bits of scrap steel as well as shredded, and they will have a different kind of spectral response. But also you can use just optical imagery, and you'll see from a different you'll see just visually that they will have a different kind of look with them as well. So there are lots of different ways to kind of bring these different bits together, and the aim is to really automate it to a certain level. You'll never be 100% right, but to do it automatically and get 80-90% right is a good position to be in. So it is possible, and the question really is how important and how valuable is it for you to know, and so on, where they are, and that's always kind of the big business case piece of just trying to make sure that you get your answer to the right level of accuracy to the cost point that
Yeah.
you want.
And I think that sort of level of information is the kind of thing that we start to define in our digital world and our BIM world, and then better understand. What I really like in my brain on that sort of supply chain intelligence is when I'm looking at disasters, is things like bottled water, things like PPE, things like drug production, understanding those factories because they're part of the supply chain back into our infrastructure to how we react to disasters. And so therefore, if those things aren't available or we can't see that they're available, sometimes a company will tell you that they're available, but they're not because they're building up their own stock levels or price on the exchange rate. So being able to see that and plug that information into our own reactions, I think is good. Anyway, no, enough of me. So I've got one more question from me, and I don't know if there's any in the audience at the moment. No, is none online? Guys, were there any questions online? Okay, none online at the moment. Okay, Jarek, with cracking presentation, love it, so much in there. Is there one piece of advice, and I'm going to go back along the whole panel here, advice to give to people that are, or organisations that are embarking along that digital world? Okay, and I'm going to come, obviously, advice to organisations embarking on the interoperability world, on planning within their temporary works, within getting engaged with the education side, and also getting involved in that intelligence side. What bit of advice would you give them when they're going to start off on that world?
Recently, I think most about the Kennedy and Apollo program, when he thought in decade we will be landing on the moon. And when I think about interoperability, about school, about what is going, we need to understand what will be legacy of ours in 10 years. With the support of other countries, it's required to make this such a huge change. Because for software vendors, when we have talks, probably you have the same, they say, oh, we don't want to change just for one standard. That the impact must be much more higher than one country, but I think it's the only way to change it. And when we talk about organization, about everyone who wants to participate, I don't believe this is our way. We can stay on the side and look that is accelerating the digital transformation, or we can jump on the boat and say, yeah, we are going, knowing that it's some limitation, that something which was developed in the past, for example, STP file, which we use in structural, it was fantastic. It was just to everything what you required. .ifc is not the best. However, when we think about all industry, it makes more sense. And the interoperability which you work, I really interested to read it, but I think is the path forward. We cannot make, and the same with schools, with the smart cities. I think it's the only way that we integrate more and more the data, information, and education. If we go to the past, to the point where we have only smart city, but we will have not smart students or pupils, how they can use it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass that down to Paul.
One thing I think organisations, but particularly the asset owners, can do is think whole life. I think look long term to when you might need to use your data over the life cycle of that asset. One of the resources that you would find on the GIG website that I shared earlier is a case study on the Environment Agency. And I know you referenced the Environment Agency and flood protection works. Now they're going to need information. People out in the field will need information about flood protection, coastal protection works for decades to come. And so they're already thinking long term. They're already putting in place the building blocks to enable themselves and their people in the field, their local authorities, insurance businesses, all use that kind of data to share flood risk And that's the value of putting data in the place that's interoperable, shareable, and enabling other organizations. They're not thinking in an insular internal process. They're looking at sharing. So the open data principles apply here, and I think that's really where if you start to think with the long term, open data becomes the logical response, as long as it's not commercially or security wise sensitive.
Right. Thanks, Paul.
So my piece of advice is that I would sex up the end vision of what we're trying to achieve. And what I mean by that is I think it's very easy to get caught up in the data and the digitization and the technology spiel. But if you actually think of UK PLC, and I know you mentioned a global basis, but just for UK PLC, for our economy to grow, for productivity to improve, for the capability of the UK to attract inward investment, we need a national digital twin so that we can work more effectively, efficiently. We can develop skills that allow us to compete on a global stage. And I think that message needs to resonate through politicians, CEOs, CIOs, and educationalists. It can be a very glamorous instigator of refiring up UK PLC, in my opinion. I think waiting to 2032 is just absolutely ridiculous and far too far in the future. In our company, we would be saying we want to do this in 2 or 3 years, never mind 10 years. And can we afford to wait 10 years to have something that can reignite UK PLC? I don't think we can.
Yeah, personal opinion on that, no, we can't. We've got to do it sooner rather than later, but yeah, you're right.
So I think my piece of advice is just don't assume that, you can just walk into school and go, how can we help? Because schools, the biggest feedback I get from people working or trying to work with schools, we can't get into schools. You can get into schools, but schools don't know what to ask for. So when you're going in and say, how can we help? They don't know what they don't know. So everything that we do in the future has to be mapped to national curriculum. It has to show what is the value. And I keep talking about cost versus value. There is a true cost of not acting now, of waiting until 2032. Value education, value your input, but for God's sake, make it understandable. The teachers don't know what to do with this great big thing that you're going to give them. Map it into national curriculum, show that there is a worth to what you're doing, and help the teachers learn. Don't worry about the children. The children will just come. Work with the teachers.
I think that resonates with so many things. Having been involved in the BIM world in the past, a lot of it has been we've missed telling people what the value is, and we've missed telling people in plain language what they need to do to get to it. So, hell yes, definitely make sure people understand that value proposition in a language that they can understand. Thank you. And Chaz.
I think, like everything, it's don't try. You've got to understand what data you already have, and you probably don't know about in your organisation, because it's usually sometimes quite hidden. And understand what information you really need versus what you think you need to kind of get to the first iteration. We've built digital twins, in telecoms for a while, and generally I find that it's only the third iteration you really then get something that is highly valuable, because you can't because I've just said you don't know what you don't know until you find out you need to know it, and the question is, how do you collect? A lot of the issue is, how do you collect that information? How do I actually get my hand on it? How do I make sure that information can be collected in a standard way? Because there's always a manual intervention somewhere. There's a mandrolic element to it all. It's never always just full of data. So to what level of accuracy also do you need to get that twin to, and that data? So I would say that you've got to avoid you've just got to jump in and start working out and be very iterative in your approach, and don't try and boil the ocean, as someone said. And but once you get it working, it really becomes significantly valuable. Yeah, I mean, it allows you to, I mean, really understand and forecast much better decision making across the board. You know, when you really need to, when the chips are down and you really need to have to make a decision, you've got the best information at hand at that time. So,
yeah, definitely. And that's
just don't be scared. Don't be scared.
Yes. Oh, indeed. We got one question in the room.
Yep, from the audience.
Sorry. What positive disruptive outcomes can the panel see from a digital transformation aspect? So, for instance, a plumbing company we've worked with recently can see that if they can get on-site data real time, rather than selling a cheap replacement pump and a panic on the capex cost, they can look at OPEX costs, they can lease a better pump that's going to last longer, for instance, if they get that data. So it sort of changes things. So whether it be the cultural aspects from the outreach or other things, what would you like to see a disruptive outcome be that's positive?
My thinking is, after this 25 years in the industry, that we going in the good direction, especially with my colleague. Over the last 3 years, we developed the standards of data required for civil structure and architecture. We're starting, and it's a game changer, because if you involve all parties, procurement, estimating, supply chain, just internally in the company, it's a different context than the UK, but it will be the same. It's scale up. Just you understand what they really need, and you limit the data which you produce, and no one look at this. In many organizations, when I'm joking a little, but it's like that, you have 10 layers, and you produce the data. The another person remove some data because it's not required. And finally, you can ask why the person from the 10th floor didn't ask me that to produce only 10% of data. That with changing our mindset, where we are going with digital twin, clearly definition what is interoperability, because it's defined what is really required, we limit the data. We also can push the software vendors that they apply it as a standard. And I think it's the pain of a small companies and organization. We cannot cope with software when we have, I will do not call them, but 3-4 major companies, and we cannot talk to each other. We use .ifc, but we know that from one, it will be different in another, and we spend again the next day, or we use ChatGPT, please make me a code how I can convert. But I think it's the goal, but we need to be united in vision that it's not coming tomorrow. It's for next few years, but I'm really positive with, indeed from my hard work, that that's the only sense. You need to define what is in American style or what is in metric, and you make a clear conversion and what is really required. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, we've got a minute.
I was just going to couple one disruption which is currently ongoing and suggest that this might be something usefully to pair the two together. Modern methods of construction. That gives big opportunities for people to produce standardized information about standardized components, and then we start to incorporate that into standardized approaches to how we deliver our infrastructure. I think the two of them together also starts to drive then production of standardized, we used to call them BIM objects, but let's move much more towards interoperable approaches to creating manufacturers' data. So it drives through the process. And ultimately, the disruption will be to the software vendors. They will be driven to the process where they've got to support interoperability. They won't compete on formats. They'll compete on the usability, efficiency, and functions and features of their software, not the height of the walls around their proprietary format.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to Chaz, Alison, Dave, Jarek and Paul for their presentations today, and thank you very much for answering our questions on there. Thank you.